complicated technology. You need help with technology, ask a 12-year-old. Morning, how are you? Great. Wonderful. Check in, grab a coffee, and grab a bagel. Good morning. Good morning. Yeah. You haven't checked in, please check in. You haven't grabbed that coffee, please grab a coffee. And what else? Looks like we're a little short on these. So for today, we'll print more, we emailed them, but if you can just share them on the table when we reference them, that'd be great. They're also, there's one on poster board behind there. We'll reference them as we bump into them. Okay, so welcome back to the world of Kabbalah, lesson 2. Today's lesson is entitled The Dawn of Limitation. For those that were not here last week, fear not. This is, we'll climb the ladder slowly together. And for those of you that were here last week that are not sure if you remember everything, also fear not. This is a lifelong journey. The video and audio of last week's class is available on YouTube. And I'm open to all kinds of questions as we navigate this. So last week we discussed the lower three world. Well, we began by introducing the concept of Seder Hishtalshalut. What I did not bring is, I did not bring the, we did not make copies of the key terms. Okay, if you have this paper from last week, you had the key terms. If you don't have it, we'll try to make sure we have those for next week. So just very briefly to recap. So we spoke about Seder Hishtalshalus, which is translated here as the system of devolution. This is the process by which God becomes manifest in a conscious way in our world. The analogy that I love that was spoken about is that the three teenagers, if you remember that, the three 14-year-olds, one who has an independent identity, one who hasn't gotten anything figured out, and the other one who's somewhere in between. And the difference is how much influence, how much consciousness of the parent is present. The more the parent takes up the space, the less the child is able to see themselves as something independent. The more the parent steps away, the more the child's able to see themselves. And so we have that process. In a similar way, in this process of devolution, the consciousness of the divine goes away or becomes diminished. And the more the consciousness of the divine becomes diminished, the more there's a consciousness of self. Okay? So, and we spoke about the three lower worlds: Bria, Yetzira, Asiya, creation, formation, and the world of action. And we spoke about these two dimensions: the dimension of what we call Yeshus, Yeshus meaning is the existence of something. Welcome back. So nice to see you. I think we got some seats right over here for you, or you can come boxy, splash zone. Yeshus means what we used the term was isness, right? Existence. And bittul, or nullification, how do they translate it here? Surrender, suspension, means I'm bringing something greater than myself into my consciousness. And this is the tension, right? The tension is between my consciousness and the divine consciousness. The more I take up space, the less there's room for God. The more God takes up space, the less there's room for me. Or that's not really fair. The more of the real me becomes present, and the less of my ego is in the way. And then finally, we drew this parallel. And it's not just the parallel because it works, but because it's true. In other words, the physical consciousness is a result of this process. This devolution actually produces the reality of the world that we live in. As we're going to elaborate on today, it's not just, oh, wow, that's really neat. This is how it works in the divine. It's pretty cool. It works that way in the human consciousness as well. It doesn't work that way. Just as in the process of the devolution of the divine, we come into a consciousness of worlds. In a similar way, outside of our essence, we have a consciousness. And that consciousness itself evolves or devolves from the intellect, which we are much more intimately connected with. And as we said, you can't turn off your intellect, right? And it's more expansive, to speech, which becomes restrictive and is already manifest outside of ourselves, to finally action, which is completely outside of ourselves, and we can engage in action and then walk away from it. So that's how it is in the divine, and that's how it is within the human experience. And what's really powerful about that, in terms of how we live our life beyond, as we discussed at the opening of the class last week, that this is not just the study of mysticism, but it's intended to be relevant and applicable in our lives, is that so often we define ourselves by our thoughts, our speech, and our action. And we are highly critical of ourselves, very judgmental of ourselves, very unforgiving, because of how we think, how we speak, or what we do. But the reality is that is not us. Those are what are called garments. And just as a garment you can put on and take off, and it may be a garment that's hard to take off, maybe because we were raised in a certain way and we adopted a certain garment, or genetically we're wired a certain way. Granted, but it's still just a garment. It doesn't make me who I am. I heard a great analogy once about this, like a parable. Somebody comes to the door. It's actually not a parable. It's a story of with the Baal Shem, I believe with the Baal Shem Tov, that he had a chassid who was struggling with controlling his thoughts. So he said, go visit my student in such and such a city. So he comes to the city and he knocks at the door, and this was a friend of his. And he says, who's there? So the student who's at the door says, it's me. It is I. So he doesn't open the door. Time goes by, he knocks at the door again, and he's, let me in. He says, who is it? He said, it's I. So this goes on for a little while, and then the guy, the student, the visiting student, gets frustrated. Eventually, he opens the door, and oh, welcome, so nice to see you. He says, tell me what went down there. He says, what brings you to town? He says, what brings me to town is that, the Baal Shem Tov sent me here to figure out how to control my thoughts. So he said, this is my house. In my house, I only let in whom I want to let in. Your house, you only let in whom you want to let in. When we are able to process that, we're able to think of our thoughts, our speech, and our action as not our house. It's window trappings, it's window coverings, but it's not who I am. Who I am transcends that. And therefore, I don't have to let any thoughts, any speech come out of my mouth or any actions be engaged in that I choose not to. Okay, so that's for last week's lesson. If you have questions, write them down. We'll pick them up at the end of today's lesson. I want to jump right into today's lesson so we don't run out of time. So I need a volunteer to begin in text 1 to please read this story. Please read it loud. Anybody? Loud voices. Thank you.
Text 1, not so. A wealthy businessman and his coachman arrived in a city one Friday afternoon. The rich man was settled at the best hotel in town, and the coachman went off to his humble lodging. Both washed and dressed for Sabbath and then set out for the synagogue for the evening prayers. On his way to school, the businessman came across a large ladder that was swerved off the road and stuck in a ditch. Looking to help the fellow in need, the businessman jumping down into the ditch and began pushing and pulling at the wagon together with his captain's driver. But for all his finesse at handling the most challenging of business deals, when it came to extracting a wagon and a team of horses from a muddy ditch, our businessman was hopelessly out of his depth. After struggling for an hour in the knee-deep mud, he succeeded only in ruining his best-suited shopping clothes, amassing a most impressive collection of cuts and bruises, and getting the wagon even more comfortably engulfed in the mud. Finally, he dragged his limping body to the synagogue, arriving a scant minute before the start of Shabbos. Meanwhile, the coachman arrived early to the synagogue and sat down to recite a few chapters of Psalms. At the synagogue, he found a group of wandering paupers, and being blessed with the most generous nature, the coachman invited them all to share his Shabbos meal. When the synagogue sexton approached the poor and homeless to arrange meal placements for them with the town householders, as is customary in Jewish communities, he received the same reply from them all. Thank you, but I have already been invited for the Shabbos meal. Unfortunately, however, the coachman's budget was hardly equal to his generous heart. It would be most difficult to believe that his dozen guests left his table with more than a shadow of a meal in their own. Thus, the coachman, with his 20 years of experience in doing wagons out of mud holes, took it upon himself to feed a small army, while the wealthy businessman, whose Shabbos meal leftovers could easily have fed every hungry man within a 10-mile district, floundered about in a ditch.
Got to drop more?
The next page.
Yeah, please.
Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak of Lubavitch told this story and explained its lesson. Every soul is entrusted with a mission unique to her alone, and is granted the specific aptitudes, talents, and resources necessary to excel in her ordained role. One must take care not to become one of those lost souls who wander helplessly through life, trying their hand at every field of endeavor except for what is truly and inherently their own.
Fantastic. Anybody ever hear of Scott Galloway? Okay, let's try one more thing here. He wrote a number of bestsellers one is called The Four, The Algebra of Happiness, Adrift in America in 100 Charts. He has a new book called The Algebra of Wealth. Anyway, he's a professor of marketing at NYU Stern School of Business. The reason why I bring him up is I just listened to a podcast interview with him, and he said something very interesting. He said it was actually an interview about his experience with anti-Semitism. He considered himself an atheist and very left, and didn't believe that anti-Semitism still existed in this country in any meaningful way, and completely, shocked by what's going on. But the interviewer then shifted to a conversation about his book, and he said, so what's your message for today's youth in relation to, not relation to Israel and anti-Semitism, but in relation to what he's preaching in his books? So he said, we've been told for a generation, follow your passion. He says, it's a mistake. He says, the people that tell you to follow your passion, they're the ones that already made the billions. You know what you should do? Follow what you're good at. Figure out what you're good at and do it every single day, incrementally. That's how you build wealth. That's how you succeed in life, which again, you can agree, disagree, but it's an interesting perspective. And I share that because when I'm preparing the class, that came to mind, that we pursue things because it feels good, because it's interesting, but not necessarily because it's the right thing for us. So how do we know what the right thing is for us? So today's lesson is going to help us uncover what is the right thing for us. Where should we be spending our time? And that relates to so many different things. It relates to a career. It relates to relationships. It relates to how we spend retirement. It relates to where we give our money. It relates to what books we read. It relates to so many different things. In the last lesson, we learned about what's known in Hebrew as levushe hanefesh, the garments of the soul. And if you're following along with the terms, the key terms, today we're going to learn about kochas hanefesh. Kochas hanefesh means powers of the soul, or soul powers. And in this discussion about soul powers, we're going to learn about what is right for us. What makes my soul unique? Now, why should a soul be unique? Why should your soul be any different than my soul? Particularly if our souls both originate in the divine, we should be just carbon copies of the same thing. And in truth, in our essence of our soul, in the very, very essence of our soul, we are the same. We all are a part of God's essence. But as we descend into this world, as things become manifest, as we're going to elaborate on today, our souls have a unique soul root, or root in the divine, and that empowers our soul to have a unique leaning towards different soul powers. I know I said a lot of words. It'll become clarified as we go through it, but let me just repeat the words for a moment. So in our essence, we all come from the same place. We come from God's essence. But as our souls descend through the spiritual cosmos, our souls take on a unique root. And that unique root becomes the identity of our soul's consciousness. And ultimately, we can relate to that. We can experience that. It doesn't, I'm not talking about mystical stuff. I'm talking about, at the end of today, you'll be able to look at yourself and actually reflect on what is it that makes you you? And where do you need to be spending your time? Where do you need to be putting your efforts so that you don't end up being the coachman, inviting guests that you can't afford to take care of, or being the wealthy person who's schlepping people out of a ditch who has no clue how to do that. Again, all good-intentioned people, but good intentions, as they say, is the path to a place that none of us want to go to. All right. So what are some factors that make up our conscious experience, right? If we think about where we lean in the careers that, right, the classic Jewish career for the early 1900 immigrants, right, was you'd be a doctor, be a lawyer, right? Everybody, why? Because that's what your parents told you they expected of you. Because everybody wanted their kids to be a doctor and a lawyer so they could make money, and they thought it was prestigious and so on and so forth. And and maybe it is a good living. But I became a rabbi. Had I been born in somebody else's home, I maybe would have chosen a different path. But it's not just what family you're in. How are you educated? How did your parents educate you? Which schools did you go to? Right? That's why when people get frustrated with where the world is leaning, the people that are the thinkers and want to make change, they go back to the education system, right? We need to change the education system if we want to change the outcome. It doesn't start at the outcome. The outcome is already the result. We need to go back to the core, right? So where are we coming from? What's our educational system that educated us in a particular path in life? Now, sometimes your skill set is not right where it needs to be, but there's a need. There's a need, a communal need. As the Mishnah says, in the place where there is no man, be a man, or the place where there's no leader, be a leader. If leadership is called upon because there's no one else to do what's needed, so you got to step forward, even if it's not necessarily in your nature. What do you enjoy doing? That's important. It may not, the problem with Scott Galloway's, what he's seeing in the world is not that, that people are doing what they're enjoying, is that they're choosing what to do only because they enjoy it. That's not enough. It's probably far more important to see what you're good at, which is also important and primarily important. But yes, it's good to do what you enjoy, but not everything in life is going to be enjoyable. Okay. I mean, we don't have to do a job that you absolutely hate. So these are multiple signposts for us to figure out where we need to be. So these, as we dig into the kochas hanefesh, the powers of the soul, we are going to get a better clarity about where our particular soul is rooted, and we'll then be able to unpack where we should have that manifest in real life. Now, here's the beauty of what we're going to do. For the next little bit, we're not going to talk about this objective of figuring out where our soul powers are. Instead, we're going to talk about God. In the context of the spiritual cosmos, remember that we're on this side, we're looking at the spiritual cosmos, and here we're talking about how it shows up in the human experience, right? So this is the order of devolution. This is the way it shows up in the divine image as it's manifest within the human being. So we're going to spend a little bit of time understanding what this is in the spiritual dimension, and then we're going to translate it down later on into our own experience. Please.
This story at home, and I was lost. Like, man, I don't understand it, but when you kind of put it together, the coachman was the person who probably would have been better at getting that wagon out of the ditch, but he decided to pass the wagon and go to the synagogue and do what was outside of his realm to do, which was feed everybody, which he couldn't afford. And the businessman who could afford to do that, he chose to go outside of his realm of expertise and try to pull the wagon out of the ditch when that wasn't his strength.
Right. Now, if you imagine what was going on in these two individuals, right? They're good people. He saw something that was necessary. He said, "Oh, I'm going to go help." Maybe he should have paused and said, and again, we're analyzing a story, something in the past, but maybe he should have paused and said, "Hey, look, yeah, I can do this, but this is going to take too long. I'm really not qualified." But instead, he went with the moment, what was calling to him, instead of saying, "What am I really good at?" And I think so often, people start off their careers. How many people make career changes? And they started off in a particular, whether they got educated that way or they were following their heart, and then they say, "I'm really not good at this." And some people stay there anyway because they like the environment. They feel like it's enjoyable. And then somewhere down the line, 20, 30 years down the line, say, I've been doing a career that I hate, right? Stop. What are you good at? Let's in other words, let's have a paradigm shift in terms of how we analyze what it is that we do, who we're in relationships with, how we spend our time, what careers we're in, how we educate ourselves, right? The goal here is to take a step back and look a little bit more objectively at what's going on. So we're going to venture into the next world. The next world, so as we said, the lower three worlds are Asiya, the world of action, the world of Yitzira, the world of formation, Bria, the world of creation, which in the human experience parallel action, speech, and thought. Now we're going to move up to the next world. Okay, this world here, it's a pretty big world. At least on our paper it is. It's a big world. It parallels the green. And this is called the world of Atzilus. Now, even though we're calling it a world, it's entirely different than the lower three worlds, the worlds of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, Biyah, that we spoke about last week. Okay, now, some of you are familiar with these topics and may have a little bit of a sense of it. Some of you are not and wondering, like, what did I just come into here? What planet are we taking off to? So, number one, you will unpack this in a way that you can digest it, number one. Number two, like any pursuit, the more you study, the more you experience, the more it becomes felt by you. I don't believe, we're not doing it in this lesson, but in a future lesson, we're going to look at the first three of these powers, which are Chachma, Bina, and Das, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. And wisdom and understanding are purely intellectual. Knowledge is experiential, right? You can understand something, but it's abstract. It belongs to someone else. Knowledge means, oh, that's about me. That's my experience. The studying doesn't automatically produce knowledge. Wisdom and understanding doesn't necessarily produce knowledge. Now, it could, if you would really invest yourself, not just in the intellectual component of wisdom and understanding, but the experiential. You have to actually transfer the intellect from it being cold intellect to being experiential. The reason why I'm sharing that, first of all, it's relevant content as we go through this course, but it's also relevant in terms of how we unpack the information today. So don't panic if you're not processing it immediately. It'll digest, and at some point you'll say, okay, I get that. I get some of it. I get more of it. It'll evolve in that way. So the next world is called Atzilus. If you look in text 2, the first of the Chabad Rebbes, the Alter Rebbe, when he was writing the Hebrew word Atzilus, he would oftentimes not be able to complete spelling out the word. And he would write Atzi. He couldn't even say, gentlemen, there's copies over there and bagels over there. He wouldn't be able to write the whole word. It was too overwhelming for him. In other words, the experience of that world was too overwhelming for him. Just to kind of take home the point that we're making here, there was a chassid, the student of the Baal Shem Tov. His name was the Rabbi Dov Ber of Mizrich. He became the Maggid of Mizrich, the second Rebbe. And when he would pray for 4 or 5 hours, great length. And his friend, who was a businessman, but they were colleagues, one day saw that the rabbi was praying for so long, and he said to him, I also am a student. I also know all this spiritual, this Kabbalistic information, this mystical information. What are you praying with for 4 or 5 hours? So he says to him, he said, tell me, what's your business? I'm in commerce. I buy and sell. He says, so what's the big deal? He says, once a year we go to the marketplace in Leipzig. Leipzig was a city somewhere in Europe, and everybody would come. It was a big conference. Everybody would come, they bring their product, and everybody would buy and sell. And then I buy enough product there, I sell enough product to last me the year. He says, I want to make a suggestion. Why do you have to go rent a coach, drive all the way to Leipzig, to go then haggle and negotiate and do all this stuff and then schlep everything back? It takes you 2 weeks. It's 2 weeks out of the year. He says, why don't you go into your office, close your eyes, and imagine yourself traveling to Leipzig, negotiating all the business, and then bringing all the product back, and you'll save yourself 2 weeks. So he says, come on, Rabbi, that's all good and fine, but it doesn't translate down into actual product. So he says the same thing. We both have the same thoughts, but I'm trying actually to get to the product. It takes time to get to the product, right? In other words, it takes time for these ideas to actually become real for us. So that's just to emphasize this notion that we're dealing with very mystical concepts, so mystical that the Alter Rebbe couldn't even write the whole word. So don't expect to walk out of here levitated. It's not going to happen. But at the same time, we can unpack the material to the extent that it can have actually real application in our lives, and money back guarantee that by the time you leave today, you'll be able to extrapolate something from today's discussion that will be relevant in your life. So let's talk about God a little bit. Can we say that God is kind, mighty, and wise? What say you? Let's take a vote. Can we say that God is kind, mighty, and wise? If you say yes, raise your hand. Don't be afraid. There's no wrong answer. Okay. So some of you said yes. Is God the transcendent one who is free of attributes, or the immanent one who bears specific praiseworthy attributes? So on the one hand, we're saying we can't say that God is kind, mighty, and wise. But if we think about it for a minute, is that really who God is? Is God defined by the fact that he's mighty? Even the fact that I'm saying that he's not he. We just say he because that's conventional. But we talk about God in the feminine as well. The divine presence known as the Shekhinah is a feminine manifestation of the divine. We just use he conventionally, because it would be weird to say it. But is that what God is? That God is kind, mighty, and wise? Is that how we define God? Or is God free of any description? So you don't have to take my word for it. We can look at text 3 from Proverbs. King Solomon says, Hashem b'chachma yasad aretz. God with wisdom founded the earth. With understanding established the heavens. With his knowledge, the depths were split. Okay, so just by the way, when we look at this map here in Hebrew, we have chachma, bina, and das. If you want to source those Hebrew words, there's a number of verses in the Torah that kind of carry this, but this is one of them. Chachma is wisdom. Kainein shemayim b'tevuna. He with understanding established the heavens. That's bina. B'daitoi tahim is nifko. That's das. That's the knowledge. So these are where the Hebrew words are rooted. Or we have another passage in Chronicles, text 4. Unto you, God, is greatness and power and beauty and triumph and splendor. For all in heaven and on earth is yours. Unto you, God, is kingship. So we're saying that God is all these things. He's wisdom. He's understanding. He's knowledge. He's greatness. He's beauty. He's endurance. He's mighty. And we can go on. We look in the Torah. The Torah says, and God said such, and God did such, and God got angry, and God was happy. And you make God happy this way, you make God angry that way. And God went out to battle. Let God go to battle for you. And the Torah, the scripture is replete with descriptors of God. And by the way, a lot of people actually who are struggling with their relationship with God have a problem with that. Like, why are we giving, like, I don't want my God to be defined as kind. I don't want him to not be kind, but I don't want to define my God as kind. I don't want to define him as mighty. I don't want to define him as just. I want him to be just, but I don't want to define him that way. I want to define you as kind and just, because you're a limited, finite human being. Do I want to define God that way? That's very limiting. It's on God's level, but it's still limiting. There was a great rabbi, Rabbi Yehuda Loew. He was known as the Maharal. He was the chief rabbi of Prague in the years 1525 to 1609. Anybody here ever visited Prague? Fascinating cemetery there. His synagogue still stands there. He's attributed to having created the Golem. A very fascinating history around the Maharal. But he was a Kabbalist, and he wrote some very fascinating Kabbalistic books. So let's read text 5. That's going to help begin to create a balance here. Any volunteers to read text 5? If you'd like a copy of the text over there, please go ahead. Remind me your name again.
Seth.
Seth, thank you.
Being is perfectly referred to God as kind of the Holy One, blessed be, as opposed to the intelligent one, blessed be. For God himself is unknowable. All that we know about God is that he is detached from and beyond every form of physicality and any existing entity. It is therefore appropriate to refer to God as the Holy One, for the Shem Kadosh describes an entity that is transcendent. Indeed, God is
so we're familiar with the word kadosh, right? Kadosh means holy. What does holy mean? I'm sorry? Good. So, but when we think about holy, we usually think our minds go to like a mystic, right? Or something you can't touch, which is all correct. Whether by choice or by circumstance, they are separated. They're separated from everything else because they're not like everything else. So when we talk about God, one of the terms that we refer to when we speak about God is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He. What does that mean? The Holy One, blessed be He. So in your next term, next to the key terms, there's a word called pshitus. Pshitus is translated as simplicity, or a state of abstractness in the sense of transcending definable qualities and specific attributes. The reality is that we are limited by language. So whatever we're going to say, we have a limitation with the language that we use. So, but what the message we're trying to convey here when we refer to God as HaKadosh Baruch Hu is that God is beyond description. So how do we reconcile this? On the one hand, we're saying, and this is understood, right? Because if God is infinite, if God is beyond, in other words, if we're giving God descriptors, that means we're limiting God, we're defining God. And if God is beyond description, which is what makes him God, then how do we reconcile the fact that the Torah itself that God gave us is referring to God with various different descriptors? How do we reconcile this tension? And in here we have, in answering this question and understanding this, we're really introduced to the most core, the most powerful understanding of the spiritual cosmos. And it is a little bit of a brain twist, not in the sense that it's hard to understand. It's just totally different thinking that we're used to delving into. And the best way to kind of understand this, and it's not my best way. I'm going to make it a little warmer because my fingers are freezing. Best way to describe this, and this is, if you look in the books in particular of Chabad philosophy, this is constant there. We're always looking at the relationship between a teacher and a student. Our relationship with God has many different dimensions. It's a child and a parent, it's a king and subject, it's a teacher and student. In the context of teacher and student, there's a lot of we're pulling apart an intellectual relationship, which has so many layers to it. And that's why we use that analogy of a teacher and student. So let's say Sir Isaac Newton shows up and he's being given a high school group to speak to. And he needs to convey his theory of universal gravitation. Okay? I see your eyes are like bulging out of your head. These teenagers, they want to go on TikTok. You want to talk to them about universal gravitation? So he says, forget about it. I got nothing we're not on the same planet. He says, please, you gotta do something. You gotta give them something. So he thinks for a minute and he says, okay, there's one strand of this overall theory that I think I can package for them. But I'm not going to give it to them in its full format, in its mathematical equation, because that'll be over their head. I'm going to tell them a story. I'm going to give them a parable and give them an analogy. And he does that. And the students are intrigued and they understand the parable and they understand the analogy. And to some extent, they're able to then parse out some of the idea of this particular strand of the overall theory of universal gravitation. So in that sense, what we are experiencing when we talk about God's attributes, that is those strands that are pulled out, packaged into parables and analogies and given to us. And so you might say that Sir Isaac Newton has two parts to his brain. There's the part that is for himself, his mind, his theories, his analysis. And there's a part of his brain that is available to others. Now, in sharing of his brain to others in this diminished fashion, is he any less his brain in its totality? He's no less the great thinker because he's unpacked a piece of it that is now available to someone else than he was before. In fact, a great teacher is one who's able to extrapolate ideas and bring them down to a level that others can experience. This makes sense? There's one problem with this parable, this analogy. Anybody know what it is? On the recipient end, something's changed. In other words, we've pulled something out of God. And in a sense, the fact that God has now manifested himself with this name, with this analogy, with this parable, would seem to be an add-on, so to speak, something new that's introduced to the essential divine experience. So we're going to put that question on the side for a moment. We'll come back to it in a little bit. But let's I think I jumped the gun there just a little bit. We'll come back to that. But let's unpack what is this analogy, using the Sir Isaac Newton example, pulling out strands. Where are those strands manifest? So those strands are manifest in these 10 soul powers. So again, in the divine, these sephiros, in Hebrew, they're called sephiros or sephirot. These are the strands that are being pulled out. These are the manifestations of the divine. Now, why this is so important to parse this out is because, as we said, the lower three worlds are something in a sense outside of God. Just like in our experience, it's inside of God, but it's outside of that essential experience. Just like our garments, thought, speech, and action is outside of ourselves, outside of our essence, even if it's inside this body. But who we are, our soul powers, are who we are. Even if it's not our essence, it's still completely unified with who we are. So in a similar way, this world of Atzilus is the divine manifestation. It's a divine expression. It's an expression of the divine, not a manifestation of the divine, which is why it remains this world, the separate world, this world of Atzilus, or Atzilut, that is so powerful that the Alter Rebbe can't even write the whole word. Are we getting this? Did I lose anybody?
So you're saying that the lower world operates, kind of exists independent of the divine expression. So I guess it could be like, like, I guess these lights are here in the room.
Look at ourselves, right? Do we walk around constantly aware that there is a divine energy that sustains us? And we're on the physical dimension of it. And as we climb the ladder, as we said, it becomes more ethereal, more spiritual, and there's more divine consciousness. By the way, when we talk about this kind of self-awareness, it exists to our entire physical universe. The entire, like Saturn and Mars and the ever-expanding, universe, the galaxies, these all belong to a physical reality. They may be untouchable for us, but when we talk about gases in outer space, they're still a physical object, right? That's all down here. That's all the physical manifestation of the world of action. Then you enter into the realms of the angels and the souls, and those are on a totally different, but even angels and souls, the fact that we can call them angels and souls means there's some identity there. They're a spiritual identity, but they are an identity. And as you climb this ladder, as we gave the analogy, there's more divine consciousness, so therefore there's less self-consciousness. And the angels become more subservient and less independent, and the souls become more enraptured with God and less independent, right? So you're correct in how you unpack that. In the world of Atzilus, and again, I think we're going to unpack the soul powers soon, but if we just think about our own experience, right? This is not 100% correct, but even think about your feelings, right? Your feelings are you. You're not trapped by them, but they are you. As opposed to what you're choosing to think about. You are not your thoughts. And the proof is because you can think something else. You're not your words. Because you can choose not to speak, or you can choose to speak something else. You're not your actions. Even if they have an impact on us or on others, that's not who we are. Right? And today in parenting, all this language that we're taught not to say to children, not to tell children, you're bad, you're good. Right? Because what are you basing? How do you know they're bad? Because they did something bad? So then say you did something bad. You're not a bad person because you did something bad. By the way, this is, I don't want to get off to another topic, even people who did really terrible things, right? When the law says that these people need to be imprisoned or even receive a capital punishment by biblical law, we're not saying that they are bad. If they possess a soul, the soul can't be bad. Their essence can't be bad. But they manifested their actions in a way that they're a danger to the world around them, and they need to be eliminated, either imprisoned or they got to be taken off the street. Parenthetically, the Rebbe was very strong about rehabilitation of prisoners. He started a whole organization that's dedicated to that objective, because taking a human being and locking them up for life, God put this being on this earth. By the way, in Jewish law, there's no real structure for prison. In Jewish law, in ancient times, there was no prison. You didn't lock people up. You give them the punishment, you give them a consequence, move on. And sometimes that consequence is capital punishment. But if they're deserving of capital punishment, remove them. If they did something wrong, you give them the punishment, whether it's physical or monetary, you move on. Because the person, the essence of the person is good. Change your behavior, change what you say. And if you need to change what you think in order to change what you say and what you behave, so do that. But that still doesn't make you who you are. You transcend that. And the reason why I'm emphasizing this is because, again, let's think about God. In this manifestation of God in the 10 Sephiros, it's not what God is doing. It's not what God is saying. It's not this creation that's come into being on even on the highest ethereal level. It is it is part and parcel with who God is. And we're going to qualify that on deeper, as we mentioned at the beginning of last class, we're going to peel away dimensions. But today we're climbing our way up. At this stage, we're understanding it through that lens. And we'll go deeper into that. So at the end of the day, this dimension of God is manifest as these 10 Sephiros. So let's look into the Sephiros for a moment. Text 6. So this comes from the Zohar, the foremost book of Kabbalistic thought. Can I get a quick volunteer to read text 6? Payman, can you read text 6 for us?
You are one, but not in the no thought can grasp you whatsoever. You are the one who has brought forth 10 ornaments, which we call the 10 Sephiros, to direct, conceal the worlds and reveal them.
So these are funny words. You are one, but not in a numerical sense. You are exalted above all the exalted ones, hidden from all the hidden ones, no thought can grasp you whatsoever. So what does it mean that God is one, but not in a numerical sense? It means that we are calling him one because he's not two. He can't be separated. But he's not one as we understand one. So when we understand thought, speech, action, that's a structure. That's a fragmentation. Do you think of your emotions as something separate from you? Do you think of your emotional leanings, your tendencies inside yourself? Do you think of them as something separate from you? You don't. You think of them, that's who I am, right? In other words, when I tell you you're not your thoughts, you can accept that. Even if it's difficult, you can definitely accept that you are not your actions. But if I tell you you are not your kindness, it's much harder to parse out because you really are. That's your tendency. Even if it already has some structure to it, even if it has some tangibility to it, it's a tangibility that's really still inherently connected with who you are. And that's what the Sephiros are. When we talk about the sephiros being kindness, discipline, and so on. These are divine manifestations, but they're manifestations of God, who he is himself. We can't separate them from God. But we wouldn't call them God. And this is the delicate parsing that we're making here. You are not, when I say you are not your tendency for kindness. It doesn't describe the totality of you. But your kindness is you. God is kind because God can't not be kind.
Interesting. I mean, this being Mother's Day, it's interesting that this dimension, like the mother is kind of that alpha, the word similar characteristics. But again, this is more the metaphysical plane for alpha. Yeah, mothers.
Yeah. That's the human relationship between child and parent is also worth looking at and parsing out where that manifests. But the challenge with the human relationship is already the child is something outside of what it's released from the parent. So it's much more, but it remains a manifestation of the parent. But that's much more an expression of the world of action, right? It is ultimately, we are all a manifestation. We say that everybody possesses the divine because we can't come from anywhere else. We are a manifestation of the divine, but we're a manifestation of the divine as we are in our own consciousness, something separate from the divine. Whereas the sephiros are part and parcel of the divine. Now, the problem with this, in parsing this out, is there's this notion that when we say that God is kind, that there's something structural there. In other words, it's no longer infinite. I mean, it may not be finite like the physical reality or even like the spiritual reality, but again, using our emotions to be the parallel for that, we just simply don't have the tools to separate that out. But we could understand that if I'm saying I am not my emotions, but my emotions are intimately an expression of who I am on the deepest of levels, so they are two separate things, let alone when we're talking about God. And we're actually calling them sephiros. We're actually calling them these things. And by the way, one of the reasons that the words sephiros are called sephiros comes from the Hebrew word mispar, to count. They're countable. And as we read in the Tikkunei Zar, it's one, but not in a one that we can use, right? So how are we doing this? So this is a very fascinating teaching from Rabbi Meir Ibn Gabbai in text 8. He says, the infinite one is perfect without any flaw. So should you assert that he has infinite power but lacks the power of finitude, you deny his perfection, right? If you say that God is only infinite and he's not finite, then you're saying that God is limited. So therefore, God must also be able to express himself in the finite, and that's not a deficiency in his infiniteness.
You also say, because you're talking about this, totally agree with that. Wouldn't you say that if God created, especially human beings, in his image, and then we do the best we can with language to define these very real emotions, whatever, that it's part of God's attempt to relate to humankind, to let us begin to, in our own little way, grasp these things like kindness or love or might or whatever it is. Like, again, it doesn't take anything away from him. It just helps us connect to the divinity, however imperfectly. He doesn't take any offense at it because that was his whole purpose, right? In the garden was to have
Relationship, yeah.
Exactly.
So you're talking about purpose. In other words, why is God doing this and how does it work and so on, which is all correct and good. Where before we get to its application, we have to understand the structure of it. The more we understand the structure, the easier it is for us to understand the manifestation of it. By the way, just to qualify what you're saying, it says that we say this in the prayers every day, you are he before the world was created, and you are he after the world was created. And like the scripture says, Ani Hashem lo shanisi, I am God, I do not change. In other words, God is unchanged by the fact that he created this universe. So what's changed? We've changed. We've come into consciousness. Doesn't mean that God didn't create a world. It doesn't mean that God didn't create, but God is unaffected by it. Because like Sir Isaac Newton, he is unchanged in his essential definition. This little shtick, I think it's a shtick, kind of captures this messaging. So here's the word Sefirot, black letters on a white background. Okay, these are white letters on a black background. Oh, wait, I guess it didn't work. Well, if you take these, you cut out the letters, right? You have a piece of paper and you cut out the letters from the paper. First, you wrote the letters on the paper, right? Are the letters something separate from the paper? No. When you cut out the letters, it's still part of the paper. It's just now become manifest, but it's still part of the paper. That's what God did. He created these sephiros, which are part of who he is, but he gave them definition. He highlighted the definition. Text 9a captures this idea. We're on page 47. Yeah, so let's read that text. Yeah, let's read this text and we'll close out this section. Anybody want to read that text? We should just kind of like go around the room here. Murray, you want to read? And you're right, yeah? Okay, go ahead.
The first of the spiro, the folklore, cannot be termed a creation. God forbid, because it is literal godliness. Rather, God condensed his life to the extent that he could manifest himself in folklore and the other attributes. The intellectual attributes are his attributes. Kindness is his kindness, and so forth.
Okay. So again, just emphasizing that point that God's wisdom is not something separate from him. It's who he is, but it has definition by calling it chachma. Go ahead.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Is the purpose of the second world that we're in, is it for us to relate better to Hashem? Or is it Hashem to condense?
Which world, I'm sorry?
This,
Yeah.
the 10th spiro? Is it for us to better relate to Hashem? Or is it to condense Hashem's energy coming towards us, or both?
I love it. Great question, and a very profound question. And I will tell you that when I was in yeshiva, you go to school, you learn a bunch of stuff, and maybe a couple of things stick with you. There was a discourse from the fifth Rebbe that discussed this question. I'm gonna package your question a little differently. And the question is, if God is all powerful, why do we need any of this? Why don't we just have God in his essence and creation, the physical consciousness? Why do we need this whole thing in between? Which is essentially what you're asking, right? Why do we need this process? And not only why do we need the process, now we have to analyze it and figure it out, and what's what, and how to, and which no matter how much we're going to understand, it's still going to remain somewhat abstract. The simple answer is that this is way too big of a gap. Meaning, if all there is God's essence and physical consciousness, we have no relationship to each other. When there's all this in between, we can already begin to tap into something that's beyond our immediate consciousness, but not God's essence. It's like, I haven't read the book, but I've seen the movie. You have a relationship to the concepts. And the reality is, it does allow for us to begin to have, I don't want to say an imagined, because it's more than imagined, it's an experienced relationship with God. And not just with God's manifestation, but with God's essence. But we get there within the human experience of intellect, emotion, thought, speech, and action, and intellect and emotion. We get there because we have access to those threads. If we didn't have access to the threads, we'd be on two different realms with no bridge possible to connect us. So just delving for a moment into the concept of these things being godliness as opposed to them being God, right? Which is what we've just kind of unpacked, that they are expressions of God. God is wisdom, God is kindness, but that's not the same as saying that looking at the kindness and the wisdom, that is God, right? On a very, very distant level, this table is energized by the divine. But if I worship the table, that's called idol worship, right? That's the prohibition. You're not allowed to worship wood or molten images or even the galaxies, which are even greater expressions of the divine, right? Which, by the way, is a big struggle in the Kabbalists to understand why, after all is said and done, we talk to God through his names. But because the names are not God, we don't worship kindness. We worship God who possesses kindness. So kindness is godliness. It's not God. And to a cute story that brings this messaging home is the first of the Chabad Rebbes, the Alter Rebbe, was once sitting, his daughter, her name was Devorah Leah, and she passed away very young. And before she passed away, she charged her father with the responsibility of raising her son, who was a little boy, 2 or 3 years old, if I remember correctly. She passed away, and the Alter Rebbe took his grandson and raised him. He ultimately became the third Rebbe. One day, this little boy, I don't know how old he was sitting on his grandfather's lap, and the grandfather was playing a game. He says to him in Yiddish, "Wo is Zayda? Where's Grandpa?" So the grandson touched the grandpa's hand. So he says, "No, das is Zayda's hand. This is grandfather's hand." So he waited a few minutes and he says to him again, "Wo is Zayda? Where's grandfather?" So he touches his grandfather's beard. He says, "No, this is Zayda's beard." Right? So they did this for a little while and the game got old. And the little grandson got off his grandfather's lap and walked out of the room, went behind the door and he said, "Zayda, Grandpa." And the grandfather came running and he says, "Da is Zayda. This is grandfather." Smart kid, became a Rebbe, right? What's going on here? Is it not true that grandfather's hand is part of grandfather? It is. But it doesn't identify grandpa. Nor does his beard, nor does any other body part. Because grandpa is the totality of this being in all of its states, in its physical manifestation and in its transcendent state. So when we look at the Sephiros, we're looking at these divine manifestations. They are godliness, not separated from God, but neither are they God. Okay, by the way, in your handout, by the way, those of you that were not here last week, I have a couple of photocopies. We also sent a link if you want to get the book online. I actually have a few copies here, extra copies of the student book if anybody wants them. Okay, so in your handout, the beauty of these teachings are that they're so relevant, they're so applicable. So, in our daily prayer, we have a structure to prayer. And the structure of prayer is really designed for us to move through this experience of these worlds, to climb from the bottom. There's the classic story with Jacob and his dream where he sees the angels going up and going down. And that ladder is the ladder of prayer, right? So our prayers go up. That's why he saw the angels going up first and then the angels going down, even though angels start at the top and then come down, because they represent the idea that in his prayers, he's sending the angels up and bringing it back. But on a much deeper level, prayer is our journey through this experience of connecting with the divine. We start on a very basic physical conscious level, recognizing our physical existence. And if you look in the structure of prayer, always welcome to join us on Saturday mornings. We do services every Saturday morning. And the format of the prayers, the morning prayers, you start with your thanking God for your own physical experience. Then we begin to delve into, even within the physical reality, things that are more abstract, the stuff that lives in the ocean and then the skies and the galaxies. And then we move into the realms of the angels and the souls. And then we finally come to the proclamation of the Shema, recognizing God's oneness. And then we enter into the Amidah, where we're having communion with God. We're having intimacy with God, right? So there's this journey climbing up, and it follows this parallel that we've been talking about. So you have some handouts here in your handouts, some discussion of that. So what are the 10 Sephiros? Okay, what are these 10 Sephiros? So if you look on page 53, figure 2.1, first we're going to briefly talk about what they are in their simple terminology. Again, we only have human terms to really understand, to experience these things. So we're going to talk about them in human terms, but we're going to talk them a little bit abstract, and then we're going to translate them down into characteristics. So we have chachma, wisdom, bina, comprehension, right? So what we're doing now is we're moving from the order of devolution into the human experience, right? We as being in the divine image. So wisdom, comprehension, knowledge. These are also 3 intellectual, right? This is if you split the human experience into 3 levels. We start with the head. We start with what goes on inside the brain, thinking. Then we go into the feeling space, and then we go into the action space. So the first 3, the intellectual space, the thinking space, is wisdom, comprehension, and knowledge. Then we move into the space of emotions: kindness, strength, beauty, victory, splendor, and foundation. And then finally, the last is called Malchus, kingdom. Now, what do these mean in their practice? So we're going to unpack that in a moment, but first, let's look at text 10. Anna, are you up to reading?
The 10 Sephiros, which unite the essence of the divine infinity, are generally depicted in Kabbalistic works in a 3-column chart. Kabbalistic works explain that the right column is associated with essence, the left column is associated with Gevurah, and the middle column is the bridge between the two, comprising both essence and Gevurah.
Okay, so let's do one more. Let's do one more text. Dan, are you up to reading?
Essence seeks to provide without limit, even if the recipient is in no need of pity, lacks nothing, and faces no difficulty. The attribute of the word seeks to exercise restraint in providing to others what they refrain from giving altogether. The attribute of compassion seeks to pity whenever it's in need. It is the mediating attribute between the Lord and compassion. For that reason, it is called pure beauty, akin to multicolored ornament that provides harmonious beauty.
Okay, so let's look at the chart here for a moment. We're going to begin to make some sense of this tree that we've been speaking about. So we've got right, we've got left, and we have center. Everything that is on the right belongs to there's a certain energy on the right, there's a certain energy on the left, and there's a unique energy that is in the center. And all of the expressions are related to each other. Just as an example, creativity and kindness are connected. Kindness is an outward expression. It's a movement out from inside to out, as is creativity, versus comprehension, which is internal. Now, these 3, kindness, discipline, and compassion, or harmonization, these are primary internal emotional characteristics. They are directly related to the next 3. The difference being that the next 3 are already related to how those are going to be expressed. So boldness, yielding, and connection are more related to expression, less related to what's going on inside. We're not gonna delve too much into that right now. We're going to focus on the 3 primary emotional characteristics: kindness, discipline, and harmonization. So kindness, chesed, is the emotion of giving. Kindness wants to give. It doesn't care who the recipient is, it just wants to give. That's the energy of kindness. And the classic biblical example of this is Abraham. Abraham was defined as kindness, so much so that rabbis teach us that the attribute, the divine attribute of kindness, this guy right over here went to God and said, since Abraham came into the picture, I'm out of a job. That's how, and the Torah tells the story that Abraham, after he had his circumcision on the third day, which is the most painful day, there were no passerbys. So if kindness is only defined when somebody's in need, I help them, then he'd be good. I got a day off today, right? But that's not what kindness is. Kindness is this inner need to give. And there was nobody there, and he was distraught, right? He could have taken 2 Tylenol and gotten a good nap, but no, he's thinking about I need to give. I got to get this. I got to unload this. So that's kindness. Discipline is the opposite. Discipline is, are you worthy of anything? Are you deserving of my kindness? Are you deserving of this thing? And it's very, very exacting. It's not about me at all. I'm looking at you. I'm doing an analysis of you. It's not about me. So that's why we call it gevura, or restraint, because its whole approach is, if you're worthy, I'll give you. If you're not worthy, I won't give it to you. Harmonization brings it together. Harmonization says, you may not be worthy, but I'm going to do it anyway. Not to your detriment, by the way. Not necessarily to you. That's not good. That's not good compassion. But good compassion says you're not worthy, but it's in your interest. Like my favorite example is, I read this many years ago. There was some punks, some teenagers that went and put a swastika on a synagogue. And they were arrested for vandalization. They came in front of a judge. They were little kids. And the judge said, okay, so he had a lot of options in front of him. So he said, you know what? You have, 50 hours of community service at this particular senior citizen home where there was a bunch of Holocaust survivors. He says, go. We'll see how fast you're going to write a swastika again, right? That is a compassionate response. There's a discipline to it, but there's also a positive agenda to teach. He didn't want to punish them for the sake of punishment, right? So, and sometimes, by the way, compassion leans the other way as well. It could be more, God bless you, it could be more giving, or it could be more holding back. When your kid wants a lollipop and is kvetching and throwing a tantrum, and it's right before bedtime, the compassionate thing is not to give it to them. It's hard, but the compassionate thing is not to give it to them. Okay, so, or another example of this is a picture, right? Black and white are primary colors, but black and white don't make for a very beautiful picture. But if you begin to mix the black and white, let alone if you introduce other colors, you can have a beautiful tapestry, you can have a beautiful painting. And by the way, not going to go down there today either, but if you take these 7 emotional characteristics, you have 49 basic combinations. And if you introduce the intellectual components, you have many more combinations. The idea is that in how we express ourselves, there's so many different ways, there's so many different avenues, how the end result shows up, which is very important for how we look at ourselves, to understand to answer the question that we started with, where do I need to be invested? What is my soul power? Where is my root soul?
Basically notes, but it's not any combination.
Sure. I mean, music is a great example of it. You have a certain basic number of expressions that how you bring them together changes the song. Not to sound too artistic, but each of us make music in this world, right? We do. Each of us brings music into the world. And how we bring music is a function, first of all, of how we bring ourselves into the world, and then how we make that music with others around us, right? So it's absolutely connected. And this is also a beautiful expression of it's finite, but it's infinite, right? It's finite, but it's infinite. There's only so many characteristics, but it's infinite and the possibilities are endless. how we can interact and how different ways we can interact. And there's always, where's the emphasis? How am I bringing myself to the table? How am I making music? These opportunities abound. Okay. The story in text 12, I'll just give you the story briefly. It's a famous story where there was somebody who wanted to convert to Judaism. And he came, there were two great scholars, Shammai and Hillel. Shammai, if you look in the Mishnah, in the transcript of the oral law, Shammai is always leaning towards harshness, towards gevura, towards discipline, and Hillel is always leaning towards chesed. So this would-be convert comes to Shammai and says, I want you to teach me the Torah while I stand on one leg. So Shammai says, go take a yoga class. No, he didn't say that. He says, the Talmud says he chased him away with a ruler. So go away. Be crazy? You can't learn the Torah on one leg. So he comes to Hillel, and Hillel says, that which is hateful to you, don't do to others. This is the Torah. The rest of it is commentary. And Hillel converted him. So what's going on in this story? So first of all, we understand their characteristics. Shammai is disciplined. He says, what are you talking about? This is nuts. And Hillel says, no, come on in. I love you. We'll figure this out. That's overly judgmental of Shammai. Shammai actually, if we think about it from a different angle, Shammai says, I don't want to play a game with you. You want to convert to Judaism? This is serious business. Don't start with these games. You want to convert to Judaism? Let's sit down. We'll study. We'll spend some time. You'll figure it out. You go through there's a process here. Hillel says, yes, you're right, Shammai, but I'm going to start him off with love. We're going to get him through the door, right? We're going to bring him in. And by the way, if you look in Jewish law, sometimes Shammai leans to Hillel and sometimes Hillel leans to Shammai because they were integrated people. They leaned in a particular direction, but they were integrated people. In other words, they ultimately had compassion, but their compassion leaned heavily in one direction because of where their root soul was. So to your point, the idea that the 10 spheres combine to create the music, the primary musical notes. Okay, so now we're gonna start wrapping up and closing out. Quick question. Sugar. Would you say sugar originates in chesed or in gevura, in kindness or in discipline? Speak up.
Both.
Why would you say that?
That's how you use it.
The sweetness of sugar, not using the sugar. Kindness.
Kindness and kindliness.
Good. Habanero sauce. Lemons. Restraint. So, fire. Kindness or discipline? Water. Rocks. Okay, so if you look on figure 2.2, you can get a little of a taste of what is. By the way, it's a very interesting thing. We all know that in Jewish law, you can't mix meat and milk, right? There are specific laws. I'm not going to give you the whole rundown here, but just to understand this, if you eat dairy, you're allowed to eat meat afterwards. If you eat meat, you have to wait before you eat the dairy afterwards. There's a period of time, 6 hours between eating meat, if meat is first. Now, why is that? Because if you look at the chart, you see that meat originates in discipline, whereas milk originates in kindness. Are you missing that? It's on page 58. Right? So meat originates in discipline, milk originates in kindness. You can put discipline on top of kindness easily. It's much more difficult to put kindness on top of discipline easy. Well, the cow as an animal is it's interesting, yeah. So the milk is, why is a milk kosher? If the animal itself could not be kosher, meaning if you slaughtered that animal and it turns out to be have an illness that would have caused it to die within the year, or a hole in the lungs, right? So in Jewish practice, after they slaughter the animal, you check the lungs, and if there's a hole in the lungs, the animal is not kosher. You can't eat it. So what about the milk that comes from that cow? So milk is an expression of the animal, but the milk itself is kindness. The meat is discipline. Again, my point here is just to say that everything ultimately trickles down. Just as it trickles down into our emotions, it trickles down into the reality of the universe. By the way, Pema, to your point, actions also. Actions can be kind actions or discipline actions. The same thing can be an expression of kindness or an expression of discipline. So yes, if you're hurting yourself with the sugar, then the action is an action of discipline, not a good discipline. It's a harshness, right? It belongs to that family. Whereas if you're using the sugar to sweeten your coffee and you're not going to overdo it, whatever, I'm not anti-sugar, but, unless you're anti-sugar. Okay. So two more things. I want to focus on a prayer on page 13, on text 13, on page 59. And then we're gonna unpack the soul powers. Okay? So on page 13, the prayer, we say this every morning. My God, the soul you placed within me is pure. You created it, you formed it, you breathed it into me. So the created, formed, you breathed it into me. Listen to those words. Created, the world of creation. You formed the world of formation. You breathed it into me. That's the world of action. There's an action item taking place. But the soul itself is pure. That belongs to this. Again, who am I? Such a powerful idea. Who am I? I am not my actions. I'm not my speech. I'm not my thoughts. I am much more essentially connected than that. I'm a different, those are all expressions of who I am. And therefore, I am not limited by any of that. That's probably the most important lesson you can take out of this is don't define yourself by how you think, what you say, and what you do. Do good things, think good things, say good things, but don't define yourself that way. Because as soon as you define yourself that way, you become limited. Okay, let's stay on target here. So what is your soul's source? So in order to figure that out, at least to get an indication, let's turn to page 61, exercise 2.1. We're actually not going to do it now. You take it home with you and go through those 12 expressions, and you will find you lean in the direction. Are you generous? 1 being not so much, 5 being very much, and so on and so forth. Go through these 12 items here, and then add up the totals in the chesed column and in the gvura column, and see how you lean. Do you lean towards chesed? Do you lean towards gvura? Now, if you're thinking about relationships, you're thinking about professions, you're thinking about music, you're thinking about artistic talents or other talents. If you are a chesed person, you're probably more artistic. Or at least your artistry is a more free-flowing artistry. If you're more of a gevura person, you may be in code, right? You may be invested in something. You're a mathematician. You may be an intellectual, a professor of some sort, right? If you're, I would imagine doctors fall into both categories. If you're a meat cutter, if you're into surgery, you might be a little bit more on the gevura side. If you're maybe a pediatrician, I don't know, maybe that's stepping out of my bounds. I don't mean to offend anybody. Okay, keep on moving here. Okay, and then if you turn to page 62, you have a lot of content there that you can study and review. Text 16. Let's do text 16. Somebody who reads loud and fast. Justin, you did good last week. Please, text 16.
God provides each individual with a unique set of abilities. Each of us must pursue our divine mission in accordance with our specific abilities and potential, for they indicate our personal responsibilities in life. Say, for example, that God gave you significant intellectual abilities. It is your duty to utilize those abilities to study Torah and to invest all your energy into this endeavor. True, you are required to observe the other mitzvah and to commit yourself to all obligations shared by all Jews. Nevertheless, since you have a unique aptitude for Torah study, you need to be extra particular and passionate about it. Or, if you are graced with a strong emotional sensitivity, it is your duty to utilize this sensitivity to show love and care to others. This includes sharing Judaism's rich heritage with Jews who never had the opportunity to learn about it, and inspiring them with love for God and love for the Torah. Again, You are also obligated to study Torah and observe the other mitzvot, but your main passion is reserved for the above stated activities, as indicated by the very fact that you have unique abilities in this area. Perhaps you are pragmatic by nature. You know how to get things done. In that case, your duty is to achieve practical competence. If there is a need to establish an institution for Jewish education, for example, it is your calling to put your abilities into practice by actively pursuing every effort to open the institution. If there is a need to solve a particular challenge that inhibits the student's performance, the building is too frigid, the dorm requires cooling, make it your duty to solve the challenge expeditiously. Or perhaps you can effectively alleviate the plight of the poor and homeless and the like. Certainly, you must also study Torah and act with emotional sensitivity, but your overarching purpose is to get things done.
Thank you. So we are multi Sephirot people, right? We are an expression of all 10, but we have a root soul or a soul root. And we lean in different ways. It's impossible for anybody to like completely, only maybe a mystic, a spiritual leader can see into your soul and tell you where your mission is, which by the way, they can and have sent people on particular missions which might have been contrary to their understanding because they knew where that was. But for the most part, we can look at ourselves and say, am I a thought person? Am I a speech person? Am I an action person? Do I lean this way? Do I lean that way? And to use that identity to guide how we engage in the world. There's a famous story a famous saying of the great Hasidic master Reb Zusha of Anapoli. He said, when I come to heaven, they're not going to ask me, why wasn't I like Abraham? Why wasn't I like Moses? They're going to ask me, why wasn't I like Zusha? Right? Releasing ourselves from this notion that I need to be like someone else. I am not someone else. They have a different soul root than I do. I need to be me. I need to activate my own soul root and live consistent. That's who I am. That's why I'm on this earth. I need to be consistent with who I am. Looking at who that is, trying to understand is my life journey and trying to act from that place. The Shammai, who we mentioned before, was of the Gevura nature, of the origin of this place of discipline. In text 18, in the Mishnah says, make your Torah a permanent fixture of your daily schedule, discipline. Say little and do much, discipline. And receive every human with a pleasant countenance, kindness. So even though Shammai was of this disciplined nature, very, this is what you got to do. Make sure your Torah is fixed. Make sure you got a schedule going. Don't talk so much. Get the action done. Good. But he also said, greet everybody with a positive countenance. You're having a bad day, it's not everybody else's problem. Show up with a smile. That's not a discipline statement. That's a kindness statement. And we have to know that we don't fall into a specific pathway that is rigid. We have to be flexible. We have to know that we're multidimensional. So just to kind of wrap up, and then we'll play a video to close out a short video to kind of capture the essence of what we spoke about today. Number one, recognize that the core of the soul is complete purity. I think we emphasize that enough. Number two, that by examining our personality, we become aware of where our soul's root is and where our mission is. And number three, that looking at that, we are empowered to reveal even the attributes that maybe are not dominant. Briefly, this point is this, that while on the one hand, we capitalize on our strengths to drive what we do, we also need to look at our weaknesses. It's also a messaging to us that we have some work to do in the places where we're particularly challenged. So both of those extremes, what we're really good at and what we're particularly challenged, are opportunities for us to activate. Where we're particularly good is related to our soul's direct root. Where we're challenged means that our soul's root is empowered to help rectify and fix and expose the part of us that faces challenge. Yes.
What is an area that someone considers a positive area where they could add to, or a negative area? Who is supposed to define that? Is that defined by our own perspective of what's positive and what's negative, or like a larger perspective? Because that whole concept
Sure.
would be like social.
Sure. Ronnie, we're going to finish something up and then we're going to switch. Okay. I'm just finishing up a class here. You can stay on.
I enjoy listening to you.
I'm going to mute you, but you can stay on. It's not a one-trick pony. We have to do our own analysis. It's like everything else in life. We have to do our own analysis. We have to consult. We have to do these three: thought, speech, and action. We got to do our own thinking. We got to discuss with others, try things out, right? The Mishnah says, acquire for yourself a teacher, acquire for yourself a friend. There are different parts. But again, the point is that unless you have a spiritual seer who can see inside your soul, we have to use the tools that are available to us. And some of it is our own analysis, and it's consulting with friends, and it's trying things. But realizing that it's not just trying and, if I make $1 million quickly, then we're in. It's also like, is that where I'm supposed to be invested? Is that difficult? Is that speaking to where I need to be working, and so on? So it's a sobering kind of perspective about life. Okay, let's hit this video and then we'll close out the class. Oh, that didn't work. Here goes my technology.
Welcome to the second video in our Kabbalistic series, where we continue our journey through the mystical realms of the Kabbalistic system. In our previous video, we delved into the worlds of Beriah, Yetzirah, and Asiya, exploring three existences that feel independent of God. Today, we venture into a divine world. Welcome to Atzilut. To truly grasp the world of Atzilut, let us ponder a basic question about God. On the one hand, our sages refer to God as the Holy One, blessed be He, choosing the word holy to emphasize that God is infinite, transcending the specific and definable qualities. On the other hand, the Torah describes God as bearing specific attributes: kind, merciful, compassionate, to name a few. So, which is it? Does God have specific
I can see, but I can't hear.
Jewish heritage.